This brings us to the first individual self in Dr. Jalal's study, Mirza Asadullah Ghalib. Dr. Jalal writes, for someone who both witnessed and recorded that watershed event in the history of Muslims in India, Ghalib's less than enthusiastic support for a Mughal empire reeling under mounting financial and political crises continues to rankle the nationalist mindset on both sides of the 1947 divide. The now being vested in the British Christians can be best encapsulated in Ghalib's couplet, Iman mujhe roke hai, jo khinche hai mujhe kufr, Kaaba mere piche hai, Kalisa mere aage. His poetry reflects a sophisticated understanding of the complexities of identity, language, and a cultural expression within a colonial context. The second individual, that grand old man of Muslim modernity, reform, and education, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. By no means was Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's claim to represent the Muslim community in India uncontested. Right off the bat, he was challenged by the orthodox as well as other voices from within the community. Among Syed Ahmed's fiercest critics was the Persian scholar Jamaluddin Afghani, who lived in India between 1879 and 1882 and called for Hindu-Muslim unity as the first step dislodging British colonialism. Afghani's strident anti-colonialism and belief in Islamic universalism found a receptive audience amongst Muslims put off by Syed Ahmed's calculated political subservience to the Raj. Dr. Jalal's Self and Sovereignty is also a study of how the Muslim community in South Asia responded to a loss of sovereignty under direct British rule, which in turn informed their need to fashion a unique Muslim politics. The book takes us from 1850 right up to the creation of Pakistan in 1947 and beyond. So how did the Muslim self locate itself in the cultural milieu of the subcontinent? What was India to this Muslim self? Dr. Jalal writes that the idea of India, or more aptly of Hindustan, had an amorphous presence even in a period when references to one's Qaum and Watan did not fit neatly into the overarching mold of a Muslim or an Indian nationalism. These were latter-day products of the creative imaginings which contributed to the construction of the dominant narrative discourses of both Muslim and Indian nationalism. There was yet no obvious tension in an affinity with one's city, region, and a religiously informed cultural identity. This might seem surprising only if one mistakes the later politicization of identity, a result of the introduction of the electoral principle in India and the ensuing battle of communitarian-based popular discourses for the projection of identity as a lived cultural experience. This brings us to the first individual self in Dr. Jalal's study, Mirza Asadullah Ghalib. Dr. Jalal writes, for someone who both witnessed and recorded that watershed event in the history of Muslims in India, Ghalib's less than enthusiastic support for a Mughal empire reeling under mounting financial and political crises continues to rankle the nationalist mindset on both sides of the 1947 divide. The supremo of Urdu lyrical poetry at its lilting best was no less pragmatic than countless others who saw no reason to perpetuate the puerile myth of Mughal sovereignty. Ghalib and his contemporaries operated in the Islamicate milieu of the late Mughal Empire, and their reaction to the sovereignty now being vested in the British Christians can be best encapsulated in Ghalib's couplet, Iman mujhe roke hai, jo khinche hai mujhe kufr, Kaaba mere piche hai, Kalisa mere aage. In short, Dr. Jalal discusses Mirza Ghalib in the context of South Asian intellectual and cultural history, particularly highlighting his role as a representative figure of the intellectual milieu during the 19th century. She underscores Ghalib's significance not only as a poet, but also as a critical observer of the social and political changes occurring in British India. His poetry reflects a sophisticated understanding of the complexities of identity, language, and a cultural expression within a colonial context. Ghalib's verses often navigate themes of love, loss, mysticism, and philosophical introspection, resonating deeply with readers across generations and cultural boundaries. Furthermore, Dr. Jalal situates Ghalib within the broader intellectual ferment of his era, where poets, writers, and intellectuals grappled with the challenges of colonialism, cultural identity, and modernity. Ghalib's poetry, characterized by its lyrical beauty and nuanced exploration of human emotions and existential dilemmas, continues to be celebrated for its timeless relevance and literary brilliance. In essence, Dr. Jalal portrays Ghalib not only as a literary icon, but also as a critical voice reflecting the intellectual and cultural ethos of 19th century South Asia, making him a pivotal figure in the region's literary and intellectual history. Sifting through Ghalib's poetry, Dr. Jalal reveals the self-consciously Muslim ethos underlying his work and the impact that the loss of Mughal sovereignty had on the Muslim mindset. It was this loss that began the process of reformulation of the idea of what it meant to be a Muslim in the imagination of the Muslim self. First, individual gave way to the second individual, that grand old man of Muslim modernity, reform and education, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. By no means was Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's claim to represent the Muslim community in India uncontested. Right off the bat, he was challenged by the orthodox as well as other voices from within the community. Not a religious scholar by training, Syed Ahmed's approach to Islamic theology and jurisprudence earned him the lacerating abuse of orthodox Muslim ulama who were either based at or products of the theological seminary at Deoband, less vociferously Farangi Mahal in Lucknow and also Barelvi. His promotion of ijtihad or independent reasoning and the disapproval of taqleed or adherence to the four authoritative schools of Islamic jurisprudence set him at loggerheads with the ulama who correctly saw in it a barely disguised assault on their preeminent status as the religious guardians of the Muslim community. While sharing an Ashraf culture, an ardor for Urdu and a core of Islamic values with Syed Ahmed's associates at Aligarh, the ulama preferred to keep these ladini or irreligious Muslims at an arm's length. The theologians were not alone in opposing Syed Ahmed's newfangled ideas. His support of Western knowledge and culture, as well as loyalty to the Raj, drew acerbic comment from Muslims attached to their societal moorings and ideal of a universal Muslim ummah. Among Syed Ahmed's fiercest critics was the Persian scholar Jamaluddin Afghani, who lived in India between 1879 and 1882 and called for Hindu-Muslim unity as the first step to dislodging British colonialism. Afghani's strident anti-colonialism and belief in Islamic universalism found a receptive audience amongst Muslims put off by Syed Ahmed's calculated political subservience to the Raj. While much of the debate focused squarely on the balance between religion and politics, it contained a categorical cultural rejection of Angreziyat, or Englishness, as represented by Sir Syed and his circle of admirers. Urdu weekly Agra Akhbar denounced the Anglo-Oriental University scheme led by Syed Ahmed as whimsical and chimerical, and the orthodox school considered him an apostate because of his fascination with European notions and sentiments of civilization and reform. The limitations of his representative credentials were tested, and he had to pander, especially on the question of women's education, where he too held that women's education should take place inside the confines of the home. He held that particular Islamic conception of women's rights in far better light than that of the English. He pointed out that deemed too irrational to enjoy legal rights, an English woman could not bring a claim against anyone, nor could anyone make a claim against her. She could neither buy nor sell goods without her husband's permission. By contrast, Islam granted rights of property and profit to a woman as an individual. A woman could freely enter any contract with a man. Her concurrence was a precondition for the legitimacy of marriage. In normative Islam, if not necessarily in Muslim practice, a woman could be an independent economic agent. She was not only free to do what she pleased with the profits, but could do what she liked with any property she owned. A Muslim woman could inherit the property of her relations, sell it, bequeath it to anyone, or give it away as waqf. To his credit, Syed Ahmed admitted that the charge of women's oppression in Islam was not without an element of truth. With the notable exception of the rules of seclusion, the women of civilized countries had decided preference above Hindustani women in all respects. Muslim women were living in a degraded condition, completely surpassed by the women of the civilized world. Blowing the bugle of civilization by colonial modernity, Sir Syed drew a distinction between the uncivilization of the Muslimans and the superior enlightenment of the Western nations. Therefore, his intention was not to pander to all Muslim prejudices, it was to weed out the more obsolete ones. He exhorted Muslims to distinguish between laws and social customs, and institutions from religion in its strict sense. For instance, the Islamic prohibition on interest was explained away as a product of certain historical circumstances that were no longer applicable. Here was pragmatism triumphing over obscurantism, not a denial of religion as the basis of cultural existence. It accompanied Syed Ahmed's attempt to push the Mohammedan family endowment bill through the Legislative Council. This was aimed at preventing the fragmentation of Muslim property through automatic division among the heirs. It gave the owners the option of bestowing it on descendants according to preference. This was immediately contested by the Muslim press, with Agra Akhbar declaring that we do not recognize him as our head, nor has the government got any reason to consider him as such. The Delhi Punch went further, publishing verses that called Syed Ahmed Khan Satan, an apostate, a bastard, and a ringleader of thieves. The Aligarh Movement was seen as the purveyor of modernist and rationalist thinking, but also as the harbinger of Muslim separatism. The more culturally exclusive and orthodox Muslims who opposed Sir Syed's modernity and rationalism, however, harbored anti-colonial feelings and the idea of Islamic universalism steeped in religious strictures at madrasas and maktabs, and quite paradoxically ended up on the side of an inclusionary and secular Indian nationalism. Jalal portrays Sir Syed as a visionary reformer who recognized the transformative power of education in empowering Muslims amongst British colonial dominance. She highlights his pioneering efforts in establishing the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in Aligarh, which later became the Aligarh Muslim University. The institution aimed to provide modern education while maintaining Islamic values. Sir Syed promoted the idea that education and scientific knowledge were essential for Muslims to progress and compete in the modern world, countering prevalent stereotypes of Muslim backwardness. Moreover, Jalal discusses Sir Syed's advocacy for a rationalist interpretation of Islam that could coexist with scientific inquiry and modernity. His writings and speeches emphasize the compatibility of Islamic principles with Western education and scientific thought, challenging both British stereotypes and conservative interpretations within the Muslim community. Politically, Sir Syed's approach evolved in response to the challenges of communal politics and the rise of Hindu nationalism. Initially advocating for Hindu-Muslim unity, he later became a prominent voice for Muslim interests as Hindu nationalism increasingly dominated the political landscape. His articulation of Muslim grievances and the need for political representation laid important groundwork for later Muslim political movements, including the demand for Pakistan.